kings don't belong on d2, and as a consequence, he's now going to suffer. So about 2 weeks ago, I uploaded a clip from one of my latest Twitch streams in which I beat a national master pretty badly with the black pieces. And it kind of made me reminisce about some of my past Blitz battles against other national masters, and one stood out in particular because it was actually the same number of moves and a very kind of similar game path to the game that I played recently. And this game was played against the National Master from Washington State with the username LM Home Team, and his USCF rating is about 2150, while mine is 1900. So he has about 250 points on me in terms of over-the-board ratings. But in Blitz, at the time, we had the exact same rating. So should be a pretty evenly matched Blitz battle, right? Well, we'll just see about that. So in the game, he opened with e4. I went for g6, the modern defense. But after d4, I decided to kind of troll him. Not him specifically, but I was kind of messing around with this opening. And I played knight f6. This is the Norwegian defense, also referred to as the rat. I kind of picked up on this opening by watching the world champ Magnus Carlsen play in some of his kind of banter blitz games in which he kind of messes around with people, because this opening is a little bit dubious. It attacks the pawn here, but it invites white to play e5, after which the knight then comes to h5, and then white can attack it again, and the knight has to drop back. But the point is it kind of probes white to overextend their pawns. And this is actually already kind of an equal position. But anyway, my opponent didn't go for this push. Instead, he just defended the pawn with knight c3. And now I played d5, just attacking the center. He goes e5 now. And now, rather than drop the knight back to d7, I played knight e4. And now it's very tempting for white to take. Of course, they can make other moves, such as like knight f3, and then I would take and give white doubled pawns. But in the game, he took, and now pawn takes. And from white's perspective, this looks like just a lost pawn, like they're just going to pick it up at any time. But in reality, it's not so simple, because although I have this kind of doubled e-pawns and this weak pawn on e4, I am also eyeing now the d4 pawn, and white has to be careful. So he played bishop e3 to just defend it, and now bishop g7, just developing, and he played c3 to kind of further defend his pawn chain, and he was probably thinking, I'm just going to pick up this pawn very simply and be a pawn up and have a very easy game. But, again, it's not so simple, because now I play c5, again challenging the center. He plays queen c2, and now I just castled. And I'm kind of just allowing him to take here. I wasn't really defending it with bishop f5, because you'll see why. And now he decided to take the pawn, which is already a little bit dangerous. A better move would have just been to do something like play bishop c4 first, then get the knight in the game, castle, and only then pick up the pawn. But he was a little bit greedy, and he took immediately here. And now I took on d4, and he recaptured. And now I play knight c6, and we can see that although he's up a pawn, his king looks quite vulnerable from this side of the board, and I'm also starting to put a lot of pressure on his center. And in this position, he actually made a very kind of simple developing looking move, knight e2, but this turned out to be quite a severe blunder. What he should have done was bring his queen back to d3, after which he can maybe come to e2, or d2 rather, and although it kind of takes some time, and he might fall behind in development, at least his queen will be safe, because queens in the center of the board make quite easy targets. Because after knight e2, not only is he blocking his bishop, but his queen has now no way back after bishop f5, which hits the queen, and his only squares are f4, h4, and f3. He chooses h4, thinking that maybe he can then play bishop h6 at some point and trade off my bishop. But this does leave his queenside incredibly vulnerable, and now it's black to move. What would you do here? How do you try to exploit the fact that his queenside is so incredibly vulnerable? So the move that I played here is knight to b4. It's such a simple move because anytime you see a king and a rook like this, there is always this fork idea with knight to c2, and typically it's easily defended, but here it's not at all, because how does he stop me from putting the knight on c2? Well, he directly can't stop it. If he plays knight c3, then check, and I'm winning the rook next move. If he brings the rook to c1, then I put my knight on d3, and now again it's a fork, and I win his rook. His king is going to be in the wilderness. But into the wilderness it has to go anyway. Here he played king to d2. Now at least he's thinking that if I play knight c2, he can slide his rook over to c1 and just hold on to his material, but that ain't happening because now I play rook to c8, and now I'm threatening to create another attack against this king this way. So he plays knight to c3, now blocking my rook, but there is, of course, this pin against the king, and this pawn is now vulnerable, and I'm able to just take it because kings don't belong on d2, and as a consequence, he's now going to suffer. So now he finds himself in a very precarious position. His ship is quickly sinking, and it has a massive hole in it, which is just making it a lot harder. In this position, he played a3 to attack the knight, but that only makes things worse because now my knight infiltrates with knight to c2, attacking his rook, but also attacking this pawn on d4. And after rook moved to c1, now I'm able to pick up the pawn because, of course, I have sufficient protection with the bishop and the queen. And not only is his center completely busted, but now I'm even threatening some discovered checks with knight to b3 and attack his king. So he decided to get rid of the knight, but now I simply recapture with the bishop. And even still, his king is in the line of fire. He has to get it out of the way. So the king returns to e1, and now if only he could get his bishop developed and maybe manually castle his king, as he can't castle normally, he might be fine. But in this position, I found basically a knockout blow, which caused him to resign the next move, and it was actually a very simple move. I simply played queen to b6, which lines the queen and the bishop up against this f2 pawn, meaning his queen can't really move now, but more importantly, it attacks his b2 pawn, which is incredibly vulnerable and actually completely indefensible. Because anywhere the rook would try to go to defend it, the bishop will take, and if it moves forward, then, well, it leaves the knight behind. So in this position, he just correctly realized that there's nothing he can do. He's just going to get completely crushed here and resigned after only 18 moves. A game gone completely wrong for him. It kind of goes to show what happens if you get a little too greedy in the opening before you're fully developed and your opponent can start an attack, which is very then hard to deal with. So I thought this was a very nice victory. He kind of threw his guns on the ground without even sacrificing any pieces here. I am up a pawn in the final position, but my position is just completely crushing. His king is left in the center. He hasn't finished his development, and he never will. This game is just a perfect example that the basic principles apply, even to titled players. You get punished very badly for making simple mistakes out of the opening, and this National Master was no exception. So I hope you enjoy the game, and stay tuned for more beatdowns of titled players on the channel.